This happened in the 1990s, 1993 to be exact. I was 28 years old at the time, fresh out of a string of odd jobs and looking for something that would stick. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan wasn't exactly a booming job market, but it suited me just fine. I'd always been more comfortable surrounded by trees than people anyway. The truck sputtered for a moment as it climbed the steep hill, groaning under the strain. I'd always liked the sound of old engines, the sort that rattled and huffed like they had a personality. Driving up this remote access road to the ranger station had become a daily routine for me. After 2 decades of odd jobs, everything from bartending to working on fishing boats, I'd found some stability as a park ranger. My name's Ryan Winters, and I guess I have a thing for jobs that make people go, "That sounds fun, but not for me." Life out here wasn't easy, but I'd rather fight off mosquitoes the size of a chihuahua than deal with the city. This part of Michigan's UP is as far removed from civilization as you can get while still being on a map. I like that. My cabin just off the shore of Lake Superior wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I kept to myself. Mostly. There was something different about today, though. Maybe it was the air, crisp and unusually still. Even the birds seemed to be having an off day, which was weird for the start of spring. The thing is, I don't get spooked easy. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out here, more than I ever mentioned to anyone, but this felt off. As I pulled up to the ranger station, I noticed the flag hanging limp on its pole, not even a whisper of wind to make it flutter. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I grabbed my gear and headed inside, the old wooden floorboards creaking under my boots. The station was a relic from the 1950s, all knotty pine and faded posters warning about forest fires. It smelled of coffee and old maps, a comforting scent I'd grown used to over the past year. "Morning, Ryan," called out Maggie, the dispatch operator. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude that had kept this place running smoothly for longer than I'd been alive. "Morning, Mags," I replied, hanging up my jacket. "Anything exciting happen while I was gone?" She snorted, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "In this place, you'd have better luck finding excitement in a retirement home bingo night." I chuckled, pouring myself a cup of coffee that could probably strip paint. As I settled into my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a nagging sensation in the back of my mind. The radio crackled to life, startling me out of my thoughts. "Base, this is Outpost 3. We've got a situation up here." Maggie set down her pen. All business now. "Go ahead, Outpost 3. We've got a report of missing hikers, group of 4 supposed to have checked in last night at Trailhead 7. Never showed." I felt my stomach tighten. Missing hikers weren't uncommon, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness of the day, or maybe I was just being paranoid. "Copy that, Outpost 3, Maggie replied. "We'll send someone to check it out." She looked at me, one eyebrow raised. "Looks like you get some excitement after all, Winters. Take the new kid with you." The new kid was Tyler Johnson, fresh out of training and eager to prove himself. He was a good kid, if a little green. As we loaded up the truck, I could see the excitement in his eyes. He hadn't been here long enough to know that excitement usually meant trouble in these parts. "Ready for some real ranger work?" I asked, tossing him the keys. He caught them, grinning. "Born ready, sir." As we pulled out of the station, I couldn't help but feel like we were driving into something we weren't prepared for. The forest loomed around us, silent and watchful. I'd spent enough time in these woods to know when something wasn't right, and everything about today was screaming danger. But we had a job to do. 4 missing hikers needed our help, and we were the only ones who could give it. As we bounced along the dirt road toward Trailhead 7, I silently hoped that this would be a routine search and rescue. Deep down, though, I knew better. The trees seemed to press in closer as we drove, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I'd never seen them look so menacing before. It was like the whole forest had transformed overnight into something darker, more primeval. "You ever been up to Trailhead 7 before, Tyler?" I asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. "No, sir. This is my first time out this far." I nodded, remembering my own first forays into the deeper parts of the forest. "It's different out here, wilder. You've got to keep your wits about you. Is it true what they say? Tyler asked, his voice lowered as if he was afraid the trees might overhear. About the things that happen out here? I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. What things? He shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. You know, the stories. Hikers going missing, strange noises in the night. Some of the guys at the station talk about other things. I sighed, knowing all too well the kind of stories that circulated among the rangers. Most were just that, stories. But some had a kernel of truth to them that was best left unexplored. Listen, kid, I said, choosing my words carefully. The forest is a dangerous place if you don't respect it. People go missing because they're unprepared or they take risks they shouldn't. As for the noises and other things, well, the mind plays tricks on you out here. It's easy to let your imagination run wild. Tyler nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Truth be told, neither was I. I'd seen things out in these woods that I couldn't explain, things that haunted the edges of my dreams. But now wasn't the time to dwell on that. We arrived at Trailhead 7 just as the sun was reaching its zenith. The parking area was empty except for a single vehicle, a beat-up old Subaru that had seen better days. It belonged to our missing hikers, no doubt. As we got out of the truck, the silence hit me like a physical force. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if all life had been sucked out of the forest, leaving behind nothing but an empty husk. All right, I said, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. Let's gear up and head out. Standard search pattern. Keep your eyes open and stay close. Tyler nodded, his earlier excitement replaced by a look of grim determination. We checked our packs, making sure we had everything we might need. First aid kit, extra water, emergency rations, flares. I'd learned long ago that it was better to be over-prepared in these situations. As we stepped onto the trail, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. The trees loomed over us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. Shadows seemed to move at the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. We moved slowly, calling out for the missing hikers every few minutes. Our voices echoed strangely in the stillness, coming back to us distorted and wrong. It was as if the forest itself was mocking our efforts. After about an hour of hiking, we came across the first sign that something was amiss. A backpack lay just off the trail, its contents scattered across the forest floor. I knelt down to examine it, my heart sinking as I took in the scene. The pack had been torn open not by animal claws or teeth, but by something else. The rips were too clean, too deliberate, and there was something else, a smell that made my nose wrinkle. It was faint but unmistakable, the coppery scent of blood. Mr. Winters? Tyler's voice was barely above a whisper. What? What did this? I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the surrounding forest. I don't know, kid, but whatever it was, it's not good. We pressed on, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The trail began to narrow, winding its way through a section of old-growth forest. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than a car and their branches twisting together to form a nearly impenetrable canopy above. It was in this section of the trail that we found the first body. The body lay face down in a small clearing, partially obscured by fallen leaves and underbrush. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for a sleeping hiker, but as we drew closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was a man, probably in his early 40s. He was dressed in typical hiking gear, sturdy boots, cargo pants, a flannel shirt, but his clothes were torn and soaked with blood, and his limbs were splayed at unnatural angles. I heard Tyler retch behind me, the sound of his vomit hitting the forest floor seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I couldn't blame him. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like this. The man's back had been opened. There was no other word for it. It was as if something had peeled back his skin and muscle with surgical precision, exposing the white gleam of his spine. But it was the lack of blood that truly unnerved me. Despite the severity of the wound, there was hardly any blood on the ground around him. "Tyler," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Radio this in. We need backup." He nodded shakily, fumbling with his radio. As he called in our grim discovery, I forced myself to examine the scene more closely. Years of training kicked in, overriding my instinct to run as far and as fast as I could. The ground around the body was undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, No footprints other than our own. It was as if the man had been dropped here from above. But that was impossible. The canopy was too thick for even a small aircraft to penetrate. As I circled the body, something caught my eye. There, partially hidden by a fallen log, was a strange marking on the ground. I brushed away some leaves, revealing a symbol etched into the dirt. It looked like a circle with a series of intricate lines radiating out from it, almost like a stylized sun. A chill ran down my spine. I'd seen this symbol before, years ago, in a part of the forest that was strictly off-limits, a place that the old-timers spoke about in hushed whispers, if they spoke of it at all. Mr. Winters? Tyler's voice snapped me back to the present. Base says to stay put. They're sending a team. I nodded, standing up and brushing the dirt from my hands. All right, we'll set up a perimeter. No one comes in or out until the team arrives. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed to press in around us, the shadows growing deeper despite the fact that it was barely past noon. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Hours passed, feeling like an eternity. The backup team was taking longer than they should have. Our radios crackled with static more often than not, making communication with base sporadic at best. As the day wore on, the temperature began to drop. A mist rolled in, curling around the trees and obscuring the trail. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Too thick, too purposeful in its movements. It seemed to avoid the body and the strange symbol, as if repelled by some unseen force. Something's wrong, I muttered, more to myself than to Tyler. They should have been here by now. Tyler, who had been unusually quiet since our grim discovery, spoke up. Mr. Winters, do you hear that? I strained my ears, trying to pick up whatever had caught Tyler's attention. At first, all I could hear was the oppressive silence that had blanketed the forest since we arrived. But then, faintly, I heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. What the hell? I breathed, my hand instinctively going to the holster at my hip. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from all around us. It was in no language I'd ever heard before, the syllables harsh and guttural. As it increased in volume, I felt a pressure building in my head like my skull was being squeezed in a vice. Tyler let out a strangled cry, clutching at his ears. Blood trickled from his nose, his eyes wide with terror. We need to move, I shouted, grabbing him by the arm. Now! We stumbled away from the clearing, leaving the body behind. The mist swirled around our feet, seeming to tug at our legs as we ran. The chanting followed us, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. As we crashed through the underbrush, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees. Dark shapes, too tall and too thin to be human, flitting between the trunks. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. My lungs burned as we ran, the icy air knifing into my chest with each desperate breath. Tyler stumbled beside me, his face pale and drawn. The chanting had reached a fever pitch, the sound seeming to vibrate in my very bones. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. We skidded to a halt, gasping for air. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the chanting had been. It felt expectant, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. What? Tyler wheezed, bent over with his hands on his knees. What was that? I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what we'd just experienced. In all my years in these woods, I'd never encountered anything like this. As we stood there trying to catch our breath and gather our wits, a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We whirled around, my hand flying to my gun. There, standing at the edge of a small clearing, was a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a man, tall and lean, but as I looked closer, I realized that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its skin was a sickly pale gray, stretched tight over a frame that seemed more avian than human. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was a lipless gash, filled with needle-sharp teeth. And on its forehead, etched into the gray flesh, was the same symbol we'd found near the body. For a moment we all stood frozen. Then, with a sound that was part screech and part laugh, the thing lunged at us. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Tyler ahead of me. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and tearing at our clothes. Behind us, I could hear the creature moving, its unnatural gait producing a rhythmic thudding that seemed to shake the very ground. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. In all my years as a ranger, I'd encountered plenty of wildlife, some of it dangerous. But this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. We burst out of the tree line onto a narrow game trail. Without thinking, I veered left, pulling Tyler with me. The kid was panting heavily, his face a mask of terror. I knew we couldn't keep up this pace for long. The sound of pursuit was growing closer. Whatever that thing was, it was fast, inhumanly fast. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was gaining on us, moving in a bizarre, loping gait that ate up the distance between us with terrifying speed. "Keep going," I yelled to Tyler, my voice hoarse. "Don't look back." We veered off the trail, plunging back into the dense underbrush. I hoped the thicker vegetation might slow our pursuer down, give us a chance to lose it. But the crashing sounds behind us told me it was still coming, tearing through the forest with single-minded determination. My lungs were burning, each breath feeling like I was inhaling fire. Tyler was starting to lag, his steps becoming unsteady. I grabbed his arm, half dragging him along. We couldn't afford to slow down, not with that thing right on our heels. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath our feet. We tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling through leaves and dirt. I felt a sharp pain in my side as I slammed into a tree, knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. "Mr. Winters?" Tyler's panicked voice snapped me back to reality. "It's coming." I struggled to my feet, ignoring the pain that shot through my ribs. Tyler was a few feet away, his face scratched and bleeding. Above us at the top of the embankment, I could see the creature. It stood perfectly still, its eyeless face turned in our direction. Then, with a movement almost too fast to follow, it began to descend. "This way," I hissed, grabbing Tyler and pulling him towards a dense thicket of bushes. We pushed through the prickly branches, thorns tearing at our skin. On the other side, we found ourselves in a small clearing dominated by a massive, gnarled oak tree. The tree was ancient, its trunk wider than a car and its branches twisting up into the canopy above. But it was what was at the base of the tree that caught my attention. There, half hidden by exposed roots, was the entrance to a cave. Without hesitation, I pulled Tyler towards it. It was our only chance. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I pushed Tyler in first, then followed, scraping my back against the rough stone as I entered. The cave was pitch black and smelled of damp earth and decay. We pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to control our ragged breathing. Outside, I could hear the creature moving, its strange gait bringing it closer to our hiding spot. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe. I could feel Tyler trembling beside me, could practically hear his heart pounding. My own wasn't much better. Then, we heard it. A low, gurgling sound, like something trying to speak underwater. It was coming from just outside the cave entrance. I tightened my grip on Tyler's arm, silently willing him to stay absolutely still. A shadow fell across the cave opening, blotting out what little light had been filtering in. The gurgling sound grew louder, accompanied by a wet, snuffling noise. It was smelling for us. I reached for my gun with my free hand, knowing it would probably be useless against this thing, but needing the reassurance of its weight. As my fingers closed around the grip, my elbow brushed against something on the cave wall. It felt like a carving of some kind, its edges worn smooth by time. In that moment, as the creature outside continued its ghastly search, a memory surfaced, a story I'd heard years ago when I first started working these woods, a story about ancient caves and the secrets they held. The snuffling at the entrance grew more frantic. I could hear claws scraping against stone as the creature tried to widen the opening. We were trapped, with nowhere left to run. In desperation, I pressed my hand against the carving on the wall, silently pleading for something. Anything that might save us from the horror that awaited just feet away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt the stone beneath my palm grow warm. A soft blue light began to emanate from the carving, growing brighter with each passing second. The gurgling outside stopped abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched keening that made my teeth ache. The light spread, racing along the walls of the cave in intricate patterns. It illuminated other carvings, symbols similar to the one we'd seen in the forest. As the light touched them, they too began to glow. The keening outside rose to a fever pitch, then cut off suddenly. The shadow at the entrance withdrew, and I could hear the sound of something large crashing away through the underbrush. For several long minutes we stood there in the softly glowing cave, hardly daring to believe we were still alive. Finally, Tyler broke the silence. "What just happened?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I shook my head, staring at the glowing symbols that surrounded us. "I don't know, kid, but I think we just stumbled into something a whole lot bigger than a simple search and rescue." As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of our situation started to sink in. We were lost in a part of the forest I'd never been in before, being hunted by something that defied explanation, and now surrounded by ancient symbols that somehow repelled our pursuer. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "All right," I said, more to myself than to Tyler. "We need to figure out where we are and find a way back to the ranger station. Whatever's going on here, we're going to need help." Tyler nodded, his face pale in the blue glow of the symbols. Do you think that thing killed the hiker we found?" The image of the mutilated body flashed through my mind, making my stomach churn. "Yeah, kid, I think it did, and I have a feeling it's responsible for the other missing hikers, too." I moved towards the cave entrance, peering out cautiously. The forest beyond was quiet, no sign of our otherworldly pursuer. But the eerie stillness that had permeated the woods all day remained, sending a shiver down my spine. "We should get moving," I said, turning back to Tyler. "It's not safe to stay in one place for too long." As we prepared to leave the relative safety of the cave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something far beyond our understanding. The glowing symbols, the monstrous creature, the strange chanting we'd heard earlier, it all pointed to something ancient and dangerous awakening in these woods. And somehow I knew that our encounter in the forest was just the beginning. Whatever was happening here, whatever forces we'd stumbled upon, they weren't going to let us go easily. As we stepped out of the cave and back into the oppressive silence of the forest, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever make it back to the ranger station alive. The weight of the gun at my hip felt woefully inadequate against the unknown horrors that awaited us, but it was all we had, that and each other. As we set off into the gathering darkness, I made a silent vow to get Tyler out of this alive, no matter what it took. Little did I know the true test of that vow was yet to come. We moved cautiously through the forest, every sense on high alert. The blue glow from the cave had faded as soon as we stepped outside, leaving us in the gathering gloom of twilight. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to snag us. "Mr. Winters," Tyler whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What was that thing back there?" I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the surrounding woods. "I don't know, kid. In all my years out here, I've never seen anything like it." But even as I said it, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind told me that wasn't entirely true. There were stories, old legends passed down by the native tribes that once called these forests home. Stories of ancient beings that walked the land long before humans arrived. Beings that were neither animal nor man, but something in between. I'd always dismissed those stories as superstition, the kind of tales people tell around campfires to scare each other. But after what we'd just seen, I wasn't so sure anymore. We trudged on through the darkening forest, trying to find some landmark that might tell us where we were. But everything looked alien in the fading light, twisted and wrong somehow. It was as if we'd stepped into another world entirely, one where the normal rules didn't apply. After what felt like hours of walking, we came upon a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, each about waist-high and covered in moss. They looked ancient, weathered by countless years of wind and rain. "We should rest for a bit," I said, eyeing the stone circle warily. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but we were both exhausted and needed to catch our breath. Tyler nodded gratefully, sinking down onto a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. I remained standing, my hand never straying far from my gun. As we sat there in silence, I noticed something odd about the stones. Despite the gathering darkness, they seemed to be giving off a faint luminescence, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And there, etched into the face of the largest stone, was a symbol that made my blood run cold. It was the same symbol we'd seen near the dead hiker, the same one that had been carved into the forehead of the creature that chased us. "Tyler," I said, my voice low and urgent. "We need to move, now." But before we could stand, a low humming filled the air. It seemed to be coming from the stones themselves, growing louder with each passing second. The symbol on the central stone began to glow, pulsing with an eerie greenish light. And then, emerging from the shadows between the trees, they came. They looked like men at first glance. Tall, unnaturally thin men dressed in tattered robes. But as they stepped into the clearing, the wrongness of them became apparent. Their limbs were too long, joints bending at impossible angles. Their faces were smooth and featureless, save for a single vertical slit where the mouth should be. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. And as they entered the stone circle, they began to chant. It was the same chanting we'd heard earlier in the forest, the sound that had driven us to flee in terror. But now, trapped in this clearing with these things, there was nowhere for us to run. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. The symbols on the stones blazed with light, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. And in the center of it all, the air began to shimmer and twist. "Mr. Winters," Tyler whimpered beside me. "What's happening?" I wished I had an answer for him. I wished I could tell him that this was all a bad dream, that we'd wake up back at the ranger station with nothing more to worry about than filing reports and checking trail markers. But as the air in the center of the stone circle tore open like a wound, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness beyond, I knew that we were far past the point of such comforting lies. Something was coming through that tear in reality. Something ancient and terrible, something that had no place in our world. And as its massive chitinous leg emerged from the vortex, followed by another and another, I realized with horrifying clarity that our ordeal in the forest had been just the beginning. The true nightmare was only just starting. The creature that emerged from the portal defied description. It was massive, easily the size of a small house, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish fusion of insect and reptile. Multiple legs, each ending in wickedly sharp claws, supported its bulk. Its head was a mass of writhing tentacles surrounding a beak-like maw filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me to my core. Dozens of them, glowing with an otherworldly intelligence, dotted its carapace. As it fully materialized in our world, those eyes swiveled in their sockets, taking in the clearing and its occupants. The robed figures had fallen prostrate before the monstrosity, their chanting now a low, reverent hum. I could feel Tyler trembling beside me, frozen in terror. I wasn't much better off myself, my mind struggling to process the impossible scene before us. Then one of those alien eyes fixed on us, and I felt a presence pushing against my mind. It was ancient beyond imagining, filled with a cold, alien hunger that threatened to overwhelm my sanity. "Run," I managed to choke out, grabbing Tyler's arm and yanking him to his feet. "Run!" We bolted from the clearing, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Behind us, I heard an unearthly shriek that seemed to shake the very air around us. The forest came alive with movement, shadows detaching themselves from the trees to give chase. We ran blindly through the darkness, branches whipping at our faces and unseen roots threatening to trip us with every step. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, inhuman shrieks and the snapping of branches mixing with the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare chase through the dark forest. But eventually, inevitably, our luck ran out. Tyler's foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. I skidded to a stop, turning back to help him up. But as I reached for him, I saw the shadows closing in around us. They resolved themselves into the shapes we'd seen earlier, the too tall, too thin figures with their featureless faces. They moved with unnatural speed and grace, quickly surrounding us in a tight circle. I drew my gun, knowing it was probably useless against these things, but unwilling to go down without a fight. Tyler scrambled to his feet, pressing his back against mine as we faced outward, watching the closing ring of horrors. "Mr. Winters," Tyler's voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear and exhaustion. I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault, kid," I replied, trying to keep my own voice steady. "Whatever happens, we're in this together." As the creatures closed in, their bodies seeming to ripple and shift in the darkness, I prepared myself for the end. But just as the first of them reached out with impossibly long fingers, a new sound cut through the night. It was a howl, but unlike any I'd ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, filled with a power that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The creatures surrounding us froze, their featureless faces turning towards the source of the sound. Then bursting from the underbrush came a massive shape. At first I thought it was a wolf, but as it charged into the circle of creatures, I realized it was far too large. It was easily the size of a bear, its fur a silvery gray that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The wolf thing tore into the creatures with savage fury, its jaws crushing limbs and its claws rending flesh. The air filled with unearthly shrieks as the creatures tried to fend off this new attacker. "Come on," I shouted to Tyler, seizing the moment of confusion to make our escape. We darted past the battle, running once more into the depths of the forest. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of combat fading, replaced by an eerie silence. We kept running, pushing our exhausted bodies to their limits. Finally, unable to go any further, we collapsed at the base of a large tree, gasping for breath. As we sat there trying to recover, a twig snapped nearby. I raised my gun, prepared for another attack. But what stepped into view made me lower the weapon in shock. It was a woman, tall and lithe, with long silver hair that seemed to shimmer in the faint moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Her eyes, when they met mine, were a striking amber color that seemed to glow with an inner light. "You're safe now," she said, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. "They won't follow you here." I struggled to my feet, positioning myself between her and Tyler. After everything we'd seen, I wasn't ready to trust anyone or anything in these woods. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice hoarse from exertion. "What were those things?" The woman's expression turned grim. "My name is Arya, and those things are the reason I'm here. They're called the Hollow Ones, servants of an ancient evil that has slumbered beneath these forests for millennia." She paused, her gaze moving between Tyler and me. "But the real question is, who are you? And how did you become involved in this?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But after the horrors we'd witnessed, after being saved by what I was now certain had been this woman in some kind of shape-shifted form, I decided that the truth was our best option. "I'm Ryan Winters," I said. "I'm a park ranger. This is Tyler Johnson, he's new to the job. We were out here investigating some missing hikers when we found—" I trailed off, the memory of the mutilated body flashing through my mind. Arya nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I see. You've stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than you could have imagined. The missing hikers, they're just the beginning. The Hollow Ones are preparing for something, a ritual that could unleash untold horrors upon this world." Tyler, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What was that? That thing we saw? The one that came through the portal?" A shadow passed over Arya's face. "That was one of the old ones, ancient beings of immense power and incomprehensible malevolence. They once ruled this world, long before humans walked the earth. The Hollow Ones seek to bring them back, to remake the world in their image." I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. The enormity of what we'd witnessed, of what was at stake, was almost too much to comprehend. "What can we do?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "How do we stop them?" Arya looked at me with a mixture of surprise and respect. "You're willing to fight, even after everything you've seen?" I glanced at Tyler, saw the determination in his eyes despite the fear, and nodded. "We're rangers. It's our job to protect these forests and the people who visit them. If there's a way to stop these Hollow Ones, we want to help." A small smile tugged at the corners of Arya's mouth. "Brave words, Ranger Winters. But this fight is unlike anything you've ever faced. The enemies we're up against are ancient and powerful, with abilities that defy your understanding of reality." "We've already seen some of that," Tyler said, his voice stronger now. "Those symbols in the cave, the ones that drove the creature away. What were they?" Arya's eyes widened slightly. "You found one of the old places of power, and the wards activated for you." She studied us more closely, her gaze seeming to penetrate to our very souls. Perhaps you have a larger role to play in this than I first thought." She turned, gesturing for us to follow. Come, we cannot linger here. The forest is no longer safe, especially not at night. I have a sanctuary nearby where we can rest and I can explain more." As we followed Arya through the darkened forest, I couldn't help but feel like we'd crossed a threshold, stepped from one world into another. The familiar woods I'd patrolled for years now felt alien and threatening, hiding untold dangers in every shadow. We walked for what felt like hours, Arya leading us along paths that seemed to appear and disappear as we traversed them. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk was easily 20 feet in diameter, its branches reaching up to form a dense canopy overhead. Arya approached the tree, placing her hand on its gnarled bark. She whispered words in a language I didn't recognize, and suddenly, an opening appeared in the trunk. Warm golden light spilled out, illuminating the clearing. "Welcome," Arya said, gesturing for us to enter, "to the heart of the forest." As we stepped through the opening in the massive oak, I felt a tingling sensation wash over my skin, like passing through an invisible barrier. The interior was nothing like I expected. Instead of the cramped wooden space I anticipated, we entered what appeared to be a vast circular chamber. The walls were alive with swirling patterns of light, reminiscent of the symbols we'd seen in the cave. The floor was a mosaic of polished stones, each one etched with intricate designs that seemed to shift and change as we moved across them. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested a large glowing crystal. "What is this place?" Tyler breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. Arya moved to the center of the room, her hand hovering over the crystal. "This is one of the last bastions of the old magic, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. It's here that we've been fighting to keep the Hollow Ones at bay." "We?" I asked, noting her use of the plural. As if in answer, figures began to emerge from alcoves around the chamber that I hadn't noticed before. They were a diverse group, men and women of various ages and ethnicities, all dressed in clothes that seemed to be a blend of modern and ancient styles. "The Guardians," Arya explained. "We are the last line of defense against the darkness that threatens to engulf this world." An older man with a neatly trimmed gray beard stepped forward. "Arya," he said, his voice carrying a hint of reproach, "you know it's dangerous to bring outsiders here." "These aren't ordinary outsiders, Thorn," Arya replied. "They've seen the Hollow Ones, survived an encounter with them, and more importantly, they activated the wards in one of the old caves." A murmur went through the gathered Guardians at this. Thorn's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "Is this true?" he asked, turning to Tyler and me. I nodded, still trying to process everything I was seeing. There was a carving on the wall. When I touched it, it started glowing blue. It drove the creature away. Thorn exchanged a significant look with Arya. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "you should tell us everything that happened to you in the forest." And so we did. Tyler and I took turns recounting our experiences, from finding the mutilated body to our encounter with the monstrous entity in the stone circle. As we spoke, I could see the Guardians exchanging worried glances. When we finished, silence fell over the chamber. Finally, Thorn spoke. "It's worse than we feared. The Hollow Ones are moving faster than we anticipated. If they've managed to open even a small portal, then we're running out of time," Arya finished for him. "Time for what?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "You still haven't explained what exactly is going on here." Thorn sighed heavily, suddenly looking every bit his age. "What's going on, Ranger Winters, is nothing less than a battle for the very soul of our world. The Hollow Ones, as we call them, are the remnants of an ancient cult that worship the Old Ones, eldritch horrors from beyond our reality." He gestured to the glowing crystal. "This is one of several nexus points scattered throughout the world. They form a network that keeps our reality separate from other places. The Hollow Ones seek to destroy these nexus points, to tear down the barriers between worlds and allow the Old Ones to return." "But why?" Tyler asked, his face pale. "Why would anyone want to do that?" A bitter laugh came from one of the other Guardians, a young woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms. "Power," she said. "They believe that by bringing about the return of the Old Ones, they'll be rewarded with unimaginable power and immortality. Instead," Arya added grimly, "they'll bring about the end of everything we know. The Old Ones care nothing for humanity. To them, we're less than insects. If they return, our world will become a nightmare beyond imagining. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to wrap my mind around the enormity of what I was hearing. So, what do we do? How do we stop them? Thorn and Arya exchanged another look. That, Thorn said, is where you two come in. The fact that you were able to activate the wards in the cave suggests that you have a latent affinity for the old magic. With training, you could become powerful allies in our fight. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Part of me wanted nothing more than to run from this, to return to the simple life I'd known before. But the memory of that thing emerging from the portal, of the horrors we'd witnessed in the forest, steeled my resolve. I'm in, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Whatever it takes to stop these hollow ones, I'll do it. Tyler nodded beside me. Me too, he said, his voice only trembling slightly. We can't let them win. Arya smiled, a fierce, proud expression. Then let your training begin. We have much to teach you, and precious little time to do it in. As the Guardians began to gather around us, preparing to initiate us into their ancient order, I couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. In the span of a single day, my entire world had been turned upside down. The forests I'd thought I knew so well had revealed secrets beyond my wildest imagination. But as I looked at Tyler, saw the determination in his eyes that mirrored my own, I knew we were where we needed to be. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever horrors we might face, we would face them together. As rangers, as guardians, as protectors of a world that would never know the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The battle for our reality had begun, and we were now on the front lines. The next few days passed in a blur of intense training and mind-bending revelations. Arya and the other Guardians pushed us to our limits, teaching us the basics of what they called hedge magic, a form of natural magic tied to the land and the ancient forces that shaped it. We learned to sense the ley lines, currents of magical energy that crisscrossed the earth. We practiced drawing on this energy, using it to create protective wards and to enhance our own physical abilities. It was exhausting, exhilarating work, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Tyler took to it like a fish to water. There was a natural talent in him that surprised even the most experienced Guardians. I, on the other hand, struggled. The concepts were so far removed from everything I'd known that it felt like trying to grasp smoke with my bare hands. On the fourth day of our training, as I sat frustrated after another failed attempt to create a simple ward, Arya approached me. You're trying too hard, she said, sitting down beside me. You're thinking of this as something separate from yourself, something to be conquered and controlled. But the magic, it's already a part of you. It always has been. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't understand. How can it be part of me when I never even knew it existed until a few days ago? Arya smiled, a gentle expression that softened her usually stern features. Tell me, Ryan, in all your years as a ranger, have you ever had moments where you just knew things? Where you could sense danger before it appeared, or find your way through the forest on instinct alone? I thought back, memories flooding in. Times when I'd change my patrol route on a hunch, only to discover hikers in distress. Moments when I'd felt an inexplicable urge to seek shelter. Minutes before unexpected storms hit. I'd always attributed it to experience, to an intimate knowledge of the forest gained over years of service. That was your magic, Arya said, reading the realization on my face. It's been with you all along, guiding you, protecting you. You just need to learn to listen to it, to trust it. She stood, offering me her hand. Come, I want to show you something. Arya led me through winding passages within the great oak, eventually emerging onto a small balcony high up in the branches. The view took my breath away. From here I could see for miles in every direction, the vast expanse of forest stretching out beneath us. Close your eyes, Arya instructed. Breathe deeply. Feel the bark beneath your feet, the wind on your skin. Listen to the rustle of leaves, the songs of birds. Let everything else fall away until there's nothing but you and the forest. I did as she said, focusing on my breathing, on the sensations around me. Gradually, I became aware of something else, a faint humming like the vibration of a plucked string, resonating through my entire being. That's it, Arya's voice came from far away. You're feeling the pulse of the forest, the flow of magic through the land. Now reach out with your mind. Follow that feeling, see where it leads you. In my mind's eye, I saw threads of light spreading out from where I stood, crisscrossing the forest in intricate patterns. Some were bright and strong, others faint and flickering, and in the distance I saw dark spots where the light seemed to be fading, being consumed by an encroaching shadow. My eyes snapped open, the vision fading but the feeling of connection remaining. I don't know how to describe it. It was beautiful, but there were places where it was dying. Arya nodded grimly. What you saw were the magical currents that flow through this land. The dark spots are places where the Hollow Ones have begun to corrupt the natural order, draining the life force to fuel their rituals. She turned to me, her amber eyes intense. This is what we're fighting for, Ryan. Not just for humanity, but for the very life of the world itself. The Old Ones are anathema to everything that lives and grows. If they return, all of this will be destroyed. I felt a surge of determination, stronger than anything I'd experienced before. Show me again, I said. I want to learn. I want to fight. Arya smiled, a fierce, proud expression. That's the spirit. Now let's begin again. Over the next few days, my progress accelerated rapidly. The magic that had once felt so foreign now came to me as naturally as breathing. I learned to cast wards, to heal minor injuries, to communicate with the spirits of the forest. It was like discovering a part of myself I never knew existed. But even as we grew stronger, we could feel the shadow of the Hollow Ones growing. Reports came in from other guardians of increased activity, of more missing persons, of strange phenomena occurring throughout the region. Then, on the 10th day of our training, everything changed. I was practicing a particularly complex ward with Tyler when we felt it. A tremor that shook the very foundations of the great oak. The crystal in the center of the main chamber flared with blinding light, then dimmed to a sickly pulse. Arya burst into the room, her face pale. "They've done it," she said, her voice tight with fear and anger. "The Hollow Ones have destroyed one of the nexus points. The veil between worlds is weakening." As if to punctuate her words, an unearthly howl echoed through the forest, a sound of such alien malevolence that it made my blood run cold. In that moment, I knew that our training time was up. Ready or not, the real battle was about to begin. Tyler and I exchanged a look, seeing our own determination reflected in each other's eyes. We had come so far from the scared, confused rangers we'd been just days ago. Now we were guardians, protectors of a world hanging on the brink of annihilation. As we gathered our gear and prepared to face whatever horrors awaited us in the forest, I couldn't help but think of how much had changed in such a short time. The world I'd known, the life I'd lived, seemed like a distant dream now. But as I felt the pulse of magic flowing through me, as I looked at the determined faces of my fellow guardians, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. Whatever came next, whatever nightmares we would face them together. The battle for our world had truly begun, and we were the last line of defense against the encroaching darkness. As we emerged from the sanctuary of the great oak, the forest that had once been so familiar to me now felt alien and threatening. The very air seemed charged with an ominous energy, heavy with the promise of impending conflict. Arya led our group, myself, Tyler, Thorn, and 3 other experienced guardians named Lyra, Kai, and Zephyr. We moved swiftly and silently through the underbrush, our senses heightened by both training and the urgency of our mission. Our destination was a place Arya called the Crossroads, an ancient site where multiple ley lines intersected. It was there, she believed, that the Hollow Ones would make their next move to weaken the veil between worlds. As we traveled, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. Just weeks ago, I had been a simple park ranger, my biggest concerns revolving around trail maintenance and campfire safety. Now I was part of an ancient order of magical guardians, racing to prevent the apocalypse. We had been moving for several hours when Kai, a tall, wiry man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, suddenly held up a hand, signaling us to stop. His eyes, a startling shade of green, scanned the surrounding forest with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Something's wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The forest, it's too quiet." He was right. I realized with a start that I couldn't hear any of the usual sounds of the forest. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if all life had fled, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural silence. Arya's face tightened with concern. "They're close," she said. "We need to move faster." We quickened our pace, no longer worrying about stealth. The oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier with each step, pressing down on us like a physical weight. As we crested a small rise, the trees suddenly thinned out, revealing a large clearing ahead. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, similar to the one Tyler and I had encountered before, but much larger. The air around the stones shimmered with an unnatural heat, distorting the view beyond. "The crossroads," Arya breathed, her voice tight with tension. "We're not too late." But even as the words left her mouth, a low thrumming chant began to echo through the clearing. Dark-robed figures emerged from the shadows between the trees, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. The Hollow Ones had arrived. "Everyone get ready," Thorn commanded, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Remember your training. We can't let them complete the ritual." We spread out along the edge of the clearing, preparing to engage the enemy. I felt the familiar tingle of magic coursing through my veins, responding to the surge of adrenaline. Beside me, Tyler's hands glowed faintly with barely contained energy. The Hollow Ones began to arrange themselves around the stone circle, their chanting growing louder and more frenzied. In the center, a tall figure raised its arms and the air within the circle began to ripple and tear. "Now!" Arya shouted, and we burst from our cover. The battle that followed was like nothing I had ever experienced. Magic crackled through the air, bolts of energy flying back and forth across the clearing. The Hollow Ones fought with a savage intensity, their bodies twisting and changing as they called upon dark powers. I found myself facing off against two of the cultists, their forms shifting between human and something decidedly not. I called upon the magic I had learned, weaving protective wards around myself and lashing out with bursts of pure energy. To my left, I saw Tyler holding his own against a particularly large Hollow One, his movements fluid and precise as he dodged attacks and countered with his own spells. Pride swelled in my chest at how far he had come in such a short time. But for every Hollow One we took down, more seemed to appear. The air grew thick with dark energy, making it hard to breathe. At the center of the stone circle, the Terran reality was growing larger, a void of absolute darkness that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the world. "We need to close that portal," Arya shouted over the din of battle, her silver hair whipping around her face as she fended off multiple attackers. Thorn nodded grimly. "Cover us," he called out before charging towards the center of the circle with Arya close behind. The rest of us redoubled our efforts, trying to clear a path for them. I lost track of time, my world narrowing to a series of desperate moments. Dodge, counter, attack, repeat. My body ached and I could feel my energy flagging, but I pushed on, knowing that failure wasn't an option. Finally, Arya and Thorn reached the center of the circle. They stood back to back, their hands joined, and began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. Light began to emanate from them, pushing back against the darkness of the portal. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The portal began to shrink, the darkness receding. But then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, something began to emerge from the void. It was massive, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes that hurt to look at directly. An old one, I realized with a jolt of terror. We were too late. As the monstrosity pulled itself into our world, I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. How could we possibly stand against something like this? But then I saw Tyler standing tall despite his exhaustion, his eyes blazing with determination. I saw Lyra and Kai, battered but unbowed, still fighting with everything they had. And I saw Arya and Thorn pouring every ounce of their power into holding back the darkness. In that moment, I made a decision. If this was to be our last stand, then we would make it count. Drawing upon reserves of strength and magic I didn't know I possessed, I charged towards the emerging Old One. I heard Tyler's shout behind me, felt him fall into step beside me. Together, we raced towards the heart of the darkness, towards a battle that would determine the fate of our world. As we closed in on the monstrous entity, time seemed to slow. I could see every detail with crystal clarity. The writhing tentacles, the myriad eyes swiveling to focus on us, the look of grim determination on Tyler's face. We reached the edge of the portal just as the Old One fully emerged. Up close, its true horror was beyond comprehension. Its very presence seemed to warp the fabric of reality around it, the air shimmering and twisting in impossible ways. But we didn't hesitate. Drawing upon every scrap of knowledge and power we had gained, Tyler and I struck out in unison. Our magic, fueled by desperation and an unwavering will to protect our world, lanced into the creature's massive form. For a moment, nothing happened. The Old One seemed to regard us with something akin to amusement, if such a being could feel such an emotion. Then slowly, impossibly, it began to retreat. Our combined magic, bolstered by the power of the ley lines converging at this spot, was actually pushing it back. Inch by agonizing inch, we forced the monstrosity back towards the portal. Arya and Thorn, seeing what we were attempting, redoubled their efforts to close the tear in reality. The air around us crackled with energy, the very ground beneath our feet trembling with the force of the magic being wielded. With a final titanic effort, we pushed the Old One back through the portal. As soon as it was through, Arya and Thorn slammed the tear shut with a thunderclap of power that knocked everyone in the clearing off their feet. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then slowly, the normal sounds of the forest began to return. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds. It was as if the world was breathing a collective sigh of relief. I lay on my back, staring up at the sky through the canopy of trees, too exhausted to move. Beside me, I heard Tyler let out a weak chuckle. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. We actually did it. I turned my head to look at him, seeing my own mix of exhaustion and disbelief mirrored on his face. "Yeah," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips despite everything. "I guess we did." Slowly, we all began to pick ourselves up. The clearing was a mess, scorch marks and uprooted trees bearing testament to the battle that had taken place. But we were alive, and more importantly, we had won. Arya approached us, her silver hair singed and her clothes torn, but a fierce pride shining in her eyes. "You two," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like what you just did. You turned the tide." Thorn joined her, his usual stoic demeanor cracked by a wide grin. "Indeed, it seems our faith in you was well placed. You've more than earned your place among the Guardians." As the gravity of what we'd accomplished began to sink in, I felt a profound sense of change settle over me. The world I'd known before, of ranger stations and trail maps, seemed like a distant memory. This new world, of magic and ancient battles and forces beyond comprehension, was now my reality. But as I looked around at my fellow Guardians, at Tyler, who had become more than just a colleague but a true friend and ally, I knew I wouldn't have it any other way. We had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As we made our way back to the sanctuary of the Great Oak, I couldn't help but smile. The forest, which had seemed so alien and threatening just hours before, now felt like home in a way it never had before. I was a part of it now, connected to it in ways I was only beginning to understand. The battle was won, but the war, I knew, was far from over. The Hollow Ones were still out there, and there would be other threats, other battles to fight. But for now, we had earned our rest. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, I felt a sense of hope and purpose that I had never known before. Whatever the future held, I was ready to face it. We all were. The world had changed, and so had we. But some things remained constant. The beauty of the forest at dawn, the strength found in friendship and shared purpose, and the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. As we entered the sanctuary, greeted by the cheers and relieved faces of our fellow Guardians, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Our story, the story of the Guardians of the Forest, was far from over. But that, as they say, is a tale for another time.